Tonight, we don't begin with a king on his throne or a knight on the battlefield. Instead, we start our journey in a place far more intimate and far more pungent, the world of medieval hygiene. We're about to step into a time when a hot bath was viewed with deep suspicion, when the scent of herbs was your only defense against the smells of the street, and when your daily routine was shaped not by science, but by a complex mixture of faith, tradition, and outright fear. This is the story of how people stayed clean, or didn't, in a world without germ theory, indoor plumbing, or deodorant. So, before we pull back the curtain on this surprisingly complex topic, find a comfortable spot and settle in. If you enjoy these quiet explorations into the past, consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. It helps us continue to create these journeys for you. We also love to see where our stories travel. So feel free to leave a comment, letting us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Dim the lights and let your mind drift back with us across centuries to a time lit only by fire and moonlight. We're not here to judge the past, but to understand it, one fragrant and sometimes not so fragrant detail at a time. Let's begin our descent into the daily lives of those who walked these muddy streets long ago. The popular image of medieval life is one of unrelenting filth. We picture peasants covered in mud, nobles with rotten teeth, and cities choked by the stench of open sewers. And while there's a kernel of truth in that, the reality is far more nuanced. Medieval people weren't inherently dirty. They simply operated under a completely different set of rules, where spiritual purity often mattered more than physical cleanliness, and where the most common-sense hygiene practices of today would have seemed like a dangerous invitation to illness or even sin. Let's start with a surprising fact that unravels this myth. In the early Middle Ages, particularly between the 5th and 11th centuries, the tradition of bathing was very much alive and well. The influence of the Roman Empire, with its grand public bathhouses and emphasis on communal soaking, hadn't completely vanished. Monasteries, the centers of learning and order, often had dedicated bathhouses where monks were required to wash regularly. For a time, being clean wasn't just healthy, it was a sign of a disciplined and orderly life. So, if early medieval society had a handle on bathing, what went so terribly wrong? The shift was gradual, but it was driven by a powerful trio of forces: fear, shifting morality, and profoundly incorrect science. As Europe moved into the High and Late Middle Ages, a new way of thinking about the human body emerged. Physicians, guided by ancient theories of humors rather than observation, began to teach that the body was a porous, vulnerable vessel. The primary culprit in this new medical philosophy was hot water. It was widely believed that bathing in hot water opened up the pores of the skin. This wasn't seen as a good thing for cleansing. Instead, it was viewed as opening countless tiny doorways through which disease or bad air could enter the body. Imagine being told that a relaxing, warm bath was the equivalent of willingly infecting yourself with whatever sickness was floating around town. This fear became especially potent during outbreaks of plague, like the Black Death in the 14th century. To the medieval mind, bathing during a plague was not just foolish, it was suicidal. This mindset is the key to understanding everything that follows. They didn't stop bathing because they enjoyed being grimy. They stopped because they genuinely believed that staying dry and keeping their pores tightly sealed was one of the only ways to stay alive. Once upon a time, in a world that hadn't yet fully surrendered to the fear of bathing, the public bathhouse was a cornerstone of urban life. Drawing inspiration from the lingering memory of Roman thermae, these establishments were vibrant hubs of social activity. In the early Middle Ages, townsfolk from various classes, from merchants to artisans, could gather in these steamy halls. It was a place to soak in warm water, to conduct business, to share gossip, and to feel a sense of communal belonging, all while getting clean. Imagine a medieval spa day where the air is thick with steam and the chatter of the entire neighborhood. But as the centuries wore on, the reputation of the bathhouse began to change. These once innocent places started acquiring a more sordid reputation. Many bathhouses, known colloquially as stews, began to offer more than just hot water and a scrubbing. The line between a public bath and a brothel started to blur. Attendants might offer extra services, and the mixed-gender environment, which had once been seen as natural and communal, now became a source of moral panic and suspicion. The water wasn't the only thing getting steamy. This moral decay did not go unnoticed by the church. With its ever-watchful eye on the souls of its flock, the clergy began to preach against the public baths. They associated these places with rampant sin, from vanity and indulgence to outright lechery. Public nudity, even for the purpose of washing, was seen as an invitation to temptation. In a society where religious authority held immense power, this condemnation was a death sentence for the bathhouse's reputation. Being clean was one thing, but risking your immortal soul for a soak was another matter entirely. The final nail in the coffin was the arrival of the Black Death. As plague ravaged Europe, the medical theories about open pores and bad air took on a terrifying urgency. Public bathhouses, with their crowds of people sharing the same steamy, recycled water, were suddenly seen as death traps. They were no longer just morally compromised. They were now believed to be epicenters of disease. Fear, more than any decree from the church, led to their widespread closure. People boarded them up, convinced they were protecting themselves from a gruesome and invisible enemy. And so, one by one, the bathhouses of Europe closed their doors. Some were repurposed, turned into workshops or storehouses. Others were simply abandoned and left to crumble, their empty halls a silent testament to a forgotten era of public hygiene. The very idea of communal bathing, once a cherished social ritual, became a relic of a more naive and trusting time. The shared tub, once a symbol of community, was now a symbol of sickness and sin. This didn't mean hygiene disappeared overnight, but it did retreat. Cleanliness became a private, more limited affair. Instead of immersing the whole body in a public tub, people began to focus on what could be washed discreetly at home with a cloth and a basin. The grand social act of bathing was replaced by a quiet, personal, and much drier routine. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of hygiene, one defined by caution and a deep-seated suspicion of water. In the monasteries, monks who had maintained bathing routines for centuries quietly lamented this shift, but even their practices came under scrutiny as the outside world grew more fearful. The golden age of the public bath was officially over. A new era had begun, one where staying clean meant avoiding the very places that had once been built for that exact purpose. The focus shifted from the bathhouse to the basin, and from the full-body soak to the careful, targeted wipe-down. Despite the church's growing suspicion and the widespread fear that a hot bath could usher in the plague, medieval people didn't entirely forsake the idea of bathing. They simply changed its frequency and purpose. Bathing transformed from a routine habit into something you might do once a season, before a major life event, or perhaps only when the alternative became a matter of public safety. The full-body soak became a rare and calculated luxury. For the nobility, a bath was a significant undertaking. Since indoor plumbing was a distant dream, the process was a marvel of manual labor. Servants would have to haul cauldron after cauldron of water, heated over a large fire, to a private chamber. There, a large wooden tub, often looking like a sawed-off barrel, would be lined with a clean linen sheet to protect the bather from splinters. This wasn't just a bath, it was a production. To make the experience more pleasant, and to mask the, well, everything, herbs and flowers were sprinkled liberally into the water. Lavender, chamomile, sage, and rosemary were popular choices, turning the tub into a fragrant, human-sized soup. The bath itself was often set up in the bedroom or another private room near a roaring fireplace for warmth. Privacy, however, was relative. Depending on one's status, servants might be present throughout the entire process. For the wealthy, bathing could even be a social affair. A husband and wife might share a tub, or a lord might conduct business from his bath while an attendant scrubbed his back. It was a moment of vulnerability and power all at once. This practice of sharing bathwater, sometimes with multiple people using the same water in succession to conserve the effort of heating it, seems shocking to us. But it was a practical reality in a world where hot water was a precious commodity. The poor, of course, had a much different experience. Their baths were less about luxury and more about sheer necessity. They bathed in nearby rivers and streams during the warmer months, a quick and efficient way to wash themselves and their clothes simultaneously. In colder weather, they might use a simple wooden tub or barrel filled with water heated over their small hearth. It was a brisk, functional affair, done quickly to conserve fuel and avoid a chill. For the vast majority of the population, especially during the harsh medieval winters, survival took precedence over hygiene. When faced with the choice between using precious firewood to cook a meal or to heat water for a bath, the decision was obvious. Instead, people relied on a strategy we might call strategic neglect. They would keep walking, keep working, and hope that the layers of wool clothing would contain the evidence of their infrequent washing. A few urban bathhouses did manage to survive the wave of closures, particularly in parts of southern Europe where Roman traditions and a warmer climate persisted. These establishments catered to those who could afford them, sometimes offering steam rooms and herbal treatments. However, they never fully shed their scandalous reputation, and visiting one was often seen as a slightly risky indulgence. Ultimately, bathing became reserved for truly special occasions. A bath was often prepared for a woman after childbirth, seen as a way to ritually cleanse and restore her. It might also be prescribed for someone recovering from a serious illness, almost like a medical treatment. A proper bath wasn't part of daily life. It was a significant event, a ritual punctuation mark in the long, unwashed sentences of a medieval existence. When full-body immersion became a rare and risky event, the medieval world turned to the next best thing for day-to-day cleanliness: the partial wash. Think of it as a meticulously targeted sponge bath, performed with a cloth, a bowl of water, and a healthy dose of pragmatism. This was the true foundation of personal hygiene for most people, a daily or weekly ritual that kept utter filth at bay. even if it didn't leave you feeling sparkling clean. Of course, they didn't have the soft, mass-produced sea sponges we know today. Instead, the tool of choice was a simple linen cloth. This would be dipped into a basin of water, sometimes cold, sometimes heated, which was often infused with fragrant herbs like rosemary or cleansing agents like vinegar. The cloth was then used to wipe down the body, focusing on the areas that needed it most. It was less of a scrub and more of a delicate, strategic dabbing. These partial washes concentrated on what we might call the high-trophic areas of the body: the hands, face, neck, and armpits. Feet were also washed regularly, especially for those who spent their days walking on dusty roads or through muddy fields. The goal wasn't to achieve a full body clean, but to manage the most noticeable sources of grime and odor. It was a system of priorities, born from a world where water and fuel were too precious to waste on the parts of you no one was going to see or smell anyway. This method worked in tandem with one of the most important, yet unsung heroes of medieval hygiene: linen undergarments. Beneath their heavy outer layers of wool or fur, people wore linen shirts, shifts, or chemises. Linen is a remarkably breathable and absorbent fabric, and it served as a crucial barrier, soaking up the sweat and dirt produced by the body throughout the day. In this sense, your undershirt was your first line of defense against yourself. The logic was simple and surprisingly effective. It was far easier, safer, and more economical to wash a linen shirt than it was to wash the person wearing it. A person of reasonable means might own several linen shifts and change them regularly, perhaps even a few times a week. Having a clean white layer of linen next to your skin was the medieval equivalent of having just taken a shower. Your outer tunic might be stained and smelly, but if your underlayer was fresh, you were considered acceptably clean. For the wealthy, this daily ritual could still be an affair of comfort. An attendant would be tasked with heating the water, mixing in fragrant herbs like marjoram or mint, and gently washing their master or mistress. It was a quiet moment of care, a small luxury that separated them from the common folk. For the peasantry, the process was far more rustic. Water boiled over the communal fire, ladled into a simple wooden bowl, and used quickly in a drafty corner of their one-room home. Even the monks, who often had more structured routines than most, relied heavily on this partial washing. Many monastic orders had rules dictating when and how hands and faces were to be washed, often linking the act to prayer and spiritual purity. It was a physical gesture with a deeply symbolic meaning, reinforcing the idea that cleanliness, however it was achieved, was a virtue. And so, this system of dabbing with cloths and regularly changing undergarments formed the backbone of medieval personal hygiene. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly had its limitations, especially on a hot day or after strenuous labor. But in a world guided by fear and faith, it was a sensible, water-wise solution that worked, more or less. If medieval hair could be summed up in a single phrase, it might be this: diligently combed, rarely washed, and perpetually at risk of smelling like either a salad or a brewery. Contrary to the popular image of everyone walking around with tangled, matted nests on their heads, medieval people did, in fact, care for their hair. They just did so with methods that would make a modern hairstylist run for the hills. Grooming was important. Our modern concept of clean, however, was not. Washing hair was an infrequent and often harsh affair. Lacking anything close to modern shampoo, the most common cleaning agent was a coarse, homemade lye soap. This was created by boiling animal fat with wood ash, resulting in a potent substance that was excellent at stripping away grease and dirt. Unfortunately, it was also excellent at stripping away the natural oils from the scalp, and if used too often, could be irritating or even caustic. For those who preferred a gentler, if stranger, approach, other recipes were available. One popular protein-rich alternative was using egg yolks as a cleanser. Imagine the sensation, sitting in a drafty, cold hut while someone works raw, slimy egg through your hair, trying to convince yourself that this was a nourishing treatment. Another common choice was to rinse hair with beer or ale. The yeast and hops were believed to add body and shine, though it likely left one smelling like they had just stumbled out of a tavern. To improve the scent and condition of the hair, people often finished with an herbal rinse, a mixture of water and vinegar, infused with herbs like rosemary, lavender, or mint, was a popular choice. This concoction served a dual purpose. It helped to cut through any soapy residue, and more importantly, it masked other, less pleasant odors. It was a form of fragrant camouflage, giving the illusion of cleanliness even if the hair itself hadn't been truly washed in weeks. The temperature of the water used for washing was also a matter of great concern. Just as with bathing, there were strong beliefs tied to it. Hot water was thought to be dangerous, potentially weakening the brain or opening the head to illness. Cold water was equally feared, believed to cause chills and sickness. The ideal was lukewarm water, a gentle temperature that was considered safe, assuming one had the time and fuel to prepare it. While washing was rare, combing was a daily ritual for all social classes. Combs were common personal items, meticulously carved from bone, wood, ivory, or horn. These combs often had two sides, one with coarse teeth for detangling, and another with very fine, closely spaced teeth. This fine-toothed side was not for styling. It was for the grim but necessary task of scraping out lice and their eggs, a constant battle in the medieval world. For the nobility, especially women, hair was a symbol of status and beauty. Long, well-kept hair was highly prized. It would be elaborately braided, coiled into intricate styles, and often hidden from public view under veils or elaborate headdresses, in keeping with Christian ideals of modesty. These styles took hours to create, and were a testament to a woman's patience and the skill of her attendants. And so, medieval hair care was a delicate balance of grooming and infrequent, harsh cleaning. It was a world where a finely carved comb was a more important tool than soap, and where the ultimate goal wasn't to be squeaky clean, but to be well coiffed, fragrant with herbs, and, above all, free from lice for at least a day. Dental care in medieval Europe was less about achieving a sparkling smile and more about fighting a desperate battle of preservation. The goal wasn't a perfect set of pearly whites. It was simply to keep as many of your teeth in your head for as long as possible. To their credit, medieval people didn't entirely ignore their oral hygiene. They just approached it with a toolkit that seems both resourceful and terrifying by today's standards. The modern toothbrush was centuries away from invention. In its place, the most common tool for cleaning teeth was a simple piece of linen cloth. People would wrap a rough-spun rag around their finger and use it to rub their teeth and gums, scrubbing away plaque and food debris. To increase the effectiveness of this manual polish, they would often dip the cloth in some kind of abrasive substance. This early form of toothpaste was made from whatever was available. Common recipes included fine salt, crushed mint leaves, or the ashes of burnt rosemary, which were thought to have whitening properties. The goal was to create a gritty texture that could scour the tooth's surface clean. While it may have been effective at removing stains, it was likely also quite harsh on the enamel. Another ingenious method involved the use of chewing sticks. These were small twigs, typically from trees like hazel, oak, or elm, which had beneficial properties. A person would chew on one end of the twig until the wood fibers frayed and separated, creating a soft, brush-like tip. They would then use this natural, biodegradable brush to scrub their teeth. It was an ancient practice, both simple and surprisingly effective. Freshening one's breath was also a major concern, especially in a world without minty mouthwash. To combat unpleasant odors, people would chew on a variety of aromatic seeds and herbs. Fennel seeds, parsley, cloves, and cardamom were all popular choices, acting as medieval breath mints. For the wealthy, who had access to expensive imported spices, the options were even more exotic. When it came to mouthwash, the options were equally potent. A common rinse involved swishing with water mixed with vinegar or even wine. The acidity was thought to kill germs and cleanse the mouth. In more refined circles, one might use a rinse made with myrrh, a fragrant resin. This was a true luxury, considering myrrh was also famously used in perfumes and embalming fluid, giving new meaning to the idea of a dead fresh smile. But what happened when a tooth became infected or decayed beyond repair? There were no fillings, root canals, or gentle dentists. The solution was simple and brutal: extraction. This task usually fell to the local barber surgeon, a man who was as skilled with a razor for shaving as he was with a pair of pliers for pulling teeth. With no anesthetic, the procedure was a terrifying ordeal of force, pain, and a prayer that the jaw wouldn't break. Despite these primitive methods, the dental health of many medieval people wasn't as bad as we might imagine. Their diets were very low in processed sugar, the main culprit behind modern tooth decay. Rural peasants often had surprisingly strong teeth, but when decay did set in, it was a swift and painful decline, and the only cure strong enough was a barber's firm grip. Let's be perfectly honest. If you were to travel back in time and take a stroll through a bustling medieval town, your first reaction would not be wonder or awe. It would be an overwhelming urge to gag. Medieval Europe was committed to an unforgettable olfactory experience. With no organized sewage systems, no garbage collection, and livestock sharing the streets with people, the average town smelled like a potent combination of mud, manure, sweat, rotting food, and a general sense of regret. This ever-present cloud of stench was the backdrop of daily life. The air was thick with the smoke from countless wood fires, the metallic tang of the blacksmith's forge, the pungent fumes from the tanner's yard, where animal hides were being treated with urine, and whatever the local butcher had just decided to fling into the central gutter. Surviving a walk through the market quarter without your eyes watering was considered a personal victory. So, how did people cope with living in this sensory chaos? They didn't have air fresheners or filtration systems, so they got creative and personal. The most elegant solution for those who could afford it was the pomander. This was a small, often beautifully crafted hollow ball, usually made of silver or gold, designed to be filled with aromatic substances, worn on a chain around the neck or hanging from a belt. It was the medieval equivalent of a personal air diffuser. Inside these pomanders, people would place a mixture of fragrant materials: cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and dried flowers like lavender and rose petals were common ingredients. A more potent and expensive filling was ambergris, a waxy substance from the digestive system of sperm whales, which has a sweet, earthy scent. The idea wasn't to purify the air, but to create a small, pleasant bubble of fragrance that you could lift to your nose whenever the surrounding stench became too much to bear. Ladies of the court had other, more subtle methods. They often tucked small sachets filled with dried herbs and scented powders into the bodices of their dresses. This served both to mask their own body odor and to act as a shield against the less than pleasant aromas of those around them. Braiding fragrant herbs like rosemary or sweet woodruff directly into their hair was another popular technique, combining fashion with functional perfumery. For the truly wealthy, actual perfumes were available, though they were a far cry from what we have today. These were typically thick, oil-based scents imported at great expense from the Middle East and Italy. Rose oil was highly prized, as was the exotic and powerful musk derived from animals like the civet cat. Applying it was a delicate process of dabbing a tiny amount onto the wrists or neck, a fragrant armor against the world. And yet, despite all these efforts, the environmental smells were inescapable. The fog of funk, as some historians have called it, was a shared, communal experience. Nobody really complained because everyone was living in the same nasal nightmare. It was a form of collective suffering, with layered notes of garlic, damp wool, and questionable sanitation. In this world, your personal scent became a powerful social signal. If you managed to smell pleasant, of lavender, or cloves, or expensive rose oil, people assumed you were either very wealthy or possibly a saint. If you didn't, you weren't necessarily an outcast. You were just normal. You were simply blending in with the rich, unavoidable tapestry of medieval smells. If you've ever had that sinking feeling of realizing you forgot to wear deodorant for the day, spend a moment to appreciate the sheer luxury of that concern. Now, imagine that feeling stretched out across your entire life, for everyone you know. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where body odor wasn't an embarrassing faux pas. It was simply a fundamental part of the human condition. There were no roll-in sticks, no aerosol sprays, and certainly no clinical strength antiperspirants. People sweated, and then they tried to make peace with it. To manage the inevitable musk, people employed a variety of clever, if not always effective, tricks. One of the most common methods was using powdered alum. This is a naturally occurring mineral salt with astringent and antibacterial properties. It wouldn't stop you from sweating, but by killing some of the bacteria that cause odor, it could reduce the intensity of the smell. People would grind it into a fine powder and apply it to their armpits, hoping for the best. Others turned to their gardens and pantries for solutions. Rinsing the underarms with vinegar was a common practice, as the acid could help neutralize odors. Some people used powdered chalk to absorb moisture, while others would create fragrant powders from crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular choices, not because they were powerful deodorants, but because they smelled distinctly better than stale sweat. The logic was simple. If you can't stop the odor, at least try to smell like a well-seasoned roast. For the upper classes, dealing with odor was also about creating distance. A perfumed handkerchief or a pomander was not just for battling the smells of the street. It was also for politely holding under your own nose when navigating a crowded, stuffy, great hall. No one wanted to smell like they'd been stewing in their own juices all day, but everyone did. The best you could hope for was to smell like floral, spiced stew. Medieval medicine also played a fascinating role in the acceptance of sweat. Physicians at the time, operating on the theory of the four humors, believed that sweating was a vital bodily function. It was seen as a way for the body to purge excess humors and cleanse itself of impurities. Therefore, actively trying to block sweat would have been seen as unhealthy and potentially dangerous. You weren't supposed to stop it. You were supposed to let it happen. You weren't unclean. You were just medically fragrant. The fashion of the era certainly didn't help matters. People were often swathed in multiple layers of heavy fabric. A linen shift, followed by a wool tunic, and perhaps even a fur-lined outer garment, created a personal ecosystem that trapped heat and moisture with ruthless efficiency. It was like wearing a mobile personal sauna, especially when combined with the heat from open fires, crowded rooms, and the occasional bout of plague-induced fever. And yet, you weren't alone in this. The person standing next to you smelled too, as did the king, the priest, and the farmer selling you onions, who likely hadn't bathed since the last major religious holiday. In a world saturated with powerful odors, individual body odor was just one note in a complex symphony. Deodorant, as we know it, wasn't real, but the quiet solidarity of shared suffering most certainly was. In a world without daily showers, effective soap, or deodorant, medieval people turned to an unlikely champion in their endless battle against grime: linen. Not the fancy tablecloths you see in movies, but the simple, humble fabric worn right next to the skin. Linen undergarments were the single most important tool in the medieval hygiene arsenal, a clever and practical solution to the problem of staying acceptably clean in a very unclean world. Beneath the heavy, often unwashable outer garments of wool, leather, and fur, nearly everyone, from peasants to princes, wore a layer of linen. For men, this was typically a long shirt or smock. For women, it was a chemise or a shift, a simple, long dress-like garment. These weren't worn for warmth, they were worn for sanitation. They were a breathable, absorbent barrier between the body and the world. The genius of this system lay in the properties of linen itself. The fabric is excellent at absorbing moisture, wicking sweat, and the body's natural oils away from the skin. This layer of linen collected the majority of the grime that a person produced throughout the day. In doing so, it kept the more expensive and difficult to clean outer layers of clothing relatively fresh for much longer. It was a shield, protecting both the wearer from their rough woolens and their woolens from the wearer. This led to the fundamental principle of medieval hygiene: wash the linen, not the person. While a full-body bath was seen as risky and labor-intensive, washing a shirt was a manageable, if still difficult, chore. People might go weeks, or even months, without a proper bath, but they would change their linen underlayer far more frequently. For a person of means, this could be as often as every few days. By medieval standards, this was the peak of personal freshness. The state of one's linen became a powerful and visible status symbol. A person whose shirt cuffs and collar were white and clean was immediately seen as prosperous, respectable, and having their life in order. It signaled that they could afford multiple sets of undergarments and had the resources to have them washed regularly. Conversely, if your linen was gray, stained, or crusty, it was a clear sign of poverty or neglect. Your undershirt spoke volumes about you before you ever said a word. This principle applied across society. A wealthy lady's fine linen shift was essential for protecting her costly silk or velvet gown from the faintest hint of sweat. A knight wore a linen tunic called an arming coif under his heavy plate armor to absorb the immense amount of sweat generated during combat and to prevent chafing. Even the poorest peasant owned at least one linen or hempen tunic, though it was likely to be patched, threadbare, and held together by sheer willpower. Of course, keeping that linen clean was a brutal task in itself. It involved boiling water, using harsh lye soap, beating the fabric against rocks in a cold river, and hoping the current didn't sweep it away. It was back-breaking work, usually done by women, but it was still considered a far more practical use of time and resources than attempting to bathe the whole family every week. In the grand calculus of medieval life, clean clothes simply mattered more than a clean body. If there was one single, unifying sensation that connected every person in the Middle Ages, from the lowest stable boy to the queen herself, it was the persistent, maddening reality of itching. This wasn't because people were allergic to wool or hay, though that was certainly possible. It was because they were in a constant state of cohabitation with an entire ecosystem of tiny, unwelcome guests, lice, fleas, and mites. Lice, in particular, were such an ordinary part of life that they were treated less like an infestation and more like annoying, ever-present roommates. You didn't get lice, you just had lice. They were the great equalizers of medieval society, making their homes in the hair and clothing of the rich and poor alike. Lice didn't care about your social status. They only cared that you were warm. So, what did people do about these constant companions? The primary weapon in the war against head lice was the comb. These were not for styling but for delousing, often finely crafted from bone, wood, or ivory. These combs featured a set of extremely fine, closely packed teeth designed for one purpose: to meticulously rake the tiny insects and their eggs, known as nits, from the strands of hair. It was a tedious, daily chore, like tending a garden, where the only thing you harvest is bugs. Another common method for dealing with lice in clothing and bedding was heat. People would boil their linen shifts and bedclothes, as the scalding water would kill the pests. Alternatively, they would hang their garments very close to a hot fire, effectively baking the lice to death. So, if you ever see a medieval illustration of someone holding their shirt up to a flame, they aren't necessarily warming it. They might be conducting a pest execution. For some, the problem required a more dramatic solution: shaving one's head. This was a particularly common practice among monks, whose tonsured hairstyle was not just a symbol of religious devotion, but also a brutally effective anti-lice strategy. With no hair, there was no home for the vermin. Some nobles might also shave their heads and then wear elaborate wigs, though, ironically, the wigs themselves could become infested if not properly cared for and cleaned. Fleas were another relentless torment, especially for those who slept on straw-filled mattresses or lived in close proximity to animals. Without chemical insecticides, fighting fleas was a frustrating battle. People would use smoke to fumigate their homes, hoping to drive the pests out. They also tucked sachets of strong-smelling herbs like mint, pennyroyal, or wormwood into their beds, believing the scent would repel the biting insects. Ultimately, however, the most common solution was simply endurance. People accepted itching and scratching as a part of their daily existence, as unavoidable as hunger or the changing of the seasons. Complaining about it would be like complaining that the sky was blue. In a world without effective pesticides, the quiet, constant scratch of fingernails against skin was just another sound in the rich symphony of medieval life. Let's discuss the medieval toilet, a term that feels wildly optimistic for what was, in reality, a masterclass in creative improvisation and strategically lowered expectations. In an age before plumbing and sewage treatment plants, the simple act of relieving oneself was an adventure, ranging from the surprisingly clever to the downright hazardous. Comfort was not the goal. Disposal was. For the elite living in castles, the height of luxury was the garderobe. This was essentially a small room or closet with a stone or wooden bench that had a hole cut into it. The shaft below the hole dropped straight down the castle wall, emptying into the moat below, or a dedicated pit known as a cesspool. They were often built protruding from the wall, offering a breezy, if vertigo-inducing, experience. The name garderobe literally means wardrobe, as it was believed the ammonia fumes from the waste below would help kill moths and other pests in the clothes that were sometimes stored there. Peasants and common townsfolk, however, had no such luxuries. For most, the toilet was simply the great outdoors. They would make use of the woods, a nearby river, or a designated ditch at the edge of the village. Some villages had communal pits or simple outhouses, which offered minimal privacy and were often shared by multiple families. It was a system based on convenience and a shared understanding that you probably shouldn't linger. For nighttime needs, or during bad weather, the star of the show was the humble chamber pot. These ceramic or metal pots were kept under the bed or in a corner of the room, ready for use at a moment's notice. Imagine the quiet intimacy of a medieval home, the entire family sleeping in one or two rooms, with the gentle clinking of the chamber pot being the only sound to break the silence of the night. The real challenge came the morning after. What did one do with the contents of a full chamber pot? In the countryside, it might be used as fertilizer for the garden, but in the crowded, narrow streets of a town, the solution was much more direct. Residents would simply open their window and hurl the contents into the street below, often with a warning cry of "Garde l'eau." This phrase, a version of the French garde l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, was a courtesy, but not a guarantee of safety for any unfortunate soul walking below. The streets themselves were the primary sewage system. Most had a central gutter or channel where waste, both human and animal, would collect and be washed away by the rain, in theory. More often than not, these gutters would clog, overflow, and fester, turning the streets into a foul-smelling quagmire. Free-roaming pigs often served as an unofficial sanitation crew, happily consuming much of the organic waste. And the question of toilet paper, not even close. People used whatever was soft and available. This could mean rags, handfuls of moss, or straw, leaves, or for the less fortunate, simply their own hand, which made the emphasis on washing hands before meals all the more critical. For the very wealthy, scraps of soft wool or old linen provided a more refined, if still disposable, option. It was a world where necessity was truly the mother of invention. Before everyone collectively decided that bathing was a suspicious and sinful activity, public bathhouses were thriving social centers in medieval Europe. These weren't just sterile rooms with tubs. They were the bustling, steamy heart of the community, a place where you could get clean, catch up on gossip, and maybe even get a haircut. Think of them as medieval community centers that just happened to have a lot of water and very few clothes. A trip to a bathhouse, often called a stew, offered a wide array of services designed for wellness and relaxation. Patrons could enjoy hot baths, sweat out their impurities in steam rooms, and even receive massages. Barbers were often on hand to offer shaves and perform minor surgical procedures, blending hygiene with healthcare. Food and drink were readily available, and musicians sometimes played to entertain the bathers, making it a truly multisensory experience. The name stews likely came from the method of heating, where a stove would heat a room filled with steam, but it quickly took on a double meaning. In the earlier, more innocent days, this wasn't always scandalous. Families might attend together, and it was seen as a natural, communal activity. The bathhouse was a place where social barriers were, quite literally, stripped away. However, human nature being what it is, the line between communal bathing and rowdy behavior grew thin. As time went on, the stews gained a reputation for being places of moral laxity. The combination of nudity, warm water, and free-flowing wine inevitably led to activities that had very little to do with getting clean. Many stews began to operate as thinly veiled brothels, where the companionship on offer was as much a draw as the bath itself. Naturally, this made the bathhouses a prime target for the church's moral crusades. Clerics and preachers railed against them, warning their congregations that these were dens of sin that led to damnation. The stews became synonymous with vice and debauchery in the public imagination. To be a frequent visitor of the stews was to risk not just your reputation, but your immortal soul. But the final, fatal blow came with the Black Death, as we've touched on. The prevailing medical theory of the time was that warm water opened the pores, allowing plague-ridden miasma or bad air to enter the body. Public baths, with their crowds of people soaking in shared water, were suddenly seen as terrifyingly efficient death traps. The fear of disease accomplished what moral condemnation alone could not. It drove people away for good. And so, the public bathhouse was doomed. The combination of a reputation for sin and the terror of the plague was too much to overcome. What was once a vibrant and essential part of town life became a symbol of everything that was dangerous and corrupt. By the 1500s, the era of the great public stews was over, and the memory of soaking with strangers was little more than a nostalgic and slightly scandalous whisper from the past. Soap in the Middle Ages was a lot like medicine at the time. It was harsh, experimental, and using it often felt more like a punishment than a pampering. It technically worked, but it did so with an aggressive, no-nonsense approach that left little room for luxury. The gentle, fragrant, pastel-colored bars we know today would have seemed like objects of pure magic to the average medieval person. The most common type of soap was a crude, homemade affair created from a hearty blend of rendered animal fat and lye. The fat, or tallow, was typically from sheep or pigs, and the lye was derived from soaking wood ash in water to create a potent alkaline solution. When these two ingredients were boiled together, a chemical reaction called saponification occurred, resulting in a substance that could cut through grease, dirt, and possibly the top layer of your skin. This early soap didn't come in elegant shapes or with pleasant scents. It was typically formed into rough, waxy lumps that looked and felt like something you would use to grease a wagon wheel. To make it, one needed a strong stomach and a great deal of patience. The process involved rendering the fat, carefully mixing it with the lye water, and stirring the pungent concoction over a fire until it thickened, then pouring it into molds to harden into blocks. because of its harsh nature. This lye-based soap was primarily used for heavy-duty cleaning tasks, most notably for doing laundry. It was excellent at stripping stains and grime from durable linen fabrics. However, it was rarely used for casual body washing. The high alkalinity of the soap could easily irritate the skin, turning what should have been a refreshing bath into an experience akin to a mild chemical burn. For the wealthy and well-connected, far more refined soaps were available. These were luxury goods, often imported from the Islamic world or from southern Europe, where soap-making was a more delicate art. The famous Castile soap from Spain, for example, was made with gentle olive oil instead of animal fat. These soaps were milder, more pleasant to use, and were coveted trade items across the Mediterranean. Owning a bar of this fine oil-based soap was a clear sign of wealth and sophistication. It was reserved for the nobility and the rich merchant class, people who could afford to care about the softness of their skin. For the vast majority of the population, however, soap remained a utilitarian substance, not a personal care product. It was something you used to wash your clothes and your dishes, and maybe your hands, but only if they were truly offensively dirty. Using soap wasn't part of a daily hygiene ritual. For many, it was a monthly event at best, like paying taxes or witnessing a full moon. It's likely that many people went their entire lives with only minimal exposure to soap, especially when they were surrounded by others doing exactly the same thing. In a world where everyone shared a certain baseline level of grime, the motivation to scrub oneself raw with harsh soap was understandably low. In medieval Europe, doing the laundry wasn't just a chore. It was a full-body workout, a community gathering, and often a direct confrontation with the elements. Forget the convenience of a washing machine. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to be willing to boil, beat, and bully the dirt out of them with nothing but your own strength and some very potent cleaning agents. The primary location for this arduous task was the nearest river or stream. This sounds picturesque until you remember that these same rivers often served as the town's sewer, a drinking trough for livestock, and the occasional disposal site for unwanted kittens. But in a world without plumbing, running water was running water, and you took what you could get. The work was almost always done by women, known as laundresses, who were respected for their stamina and feared for their arm strength. First, the linens had to be soaked. The cleaning agent of choice was either the harsh lye soap we've discussed, or, more commonly, urine. Yes, actual human urine. It was collected in pots from households and left to sit for days or even weeks until it reached peak potency. This aged concoction, known as chamber lye, was prized for its high ammonia content, which was incredibly effective at cutting through grease, lifting stains, and whitening fabric. The smell, of course, was less prized, but it was a sacrifice made in the name of cleanliness. After a thorough soaking, the heavy, sodden clothes were dragged to the riverbank. There they were scrubbed against large, flat stones or wooden washboards to work the dirt loose. The next step was a form of fabric interrogation. The clothes were beaten with large, flat wooden paddles. It was a rhythmic, noisy, and exhausting process that could last for hours. Once the clothes were deemed sufficiently clean, they had to be rinsed thoroughly in the river's current to wash away the lye or urine. Then came the back-breaking task of wringing out the heavy, waterlogged fabric by hand. With no clotheslines, they were often spread over bushes, hedges, or laid out on grassy banks. turning the landscape around a village into what looked like a perpetual, sprawling yard sale. Of course, not everyone did their own laundry. The wealthiest households employed servants to handle the task, and monasteries had lay brothers dedicated to washing the community's habits. Some larger towns even had professional guilds of washerwomen, but for the vast majority of the population, laundry day was a do-it-yourself affair, a necessary and grueling part of the weekly or monthly routine. This immense effort highlights just how important clean clothing was. You might not have bathed in a month, but if your linen shift was a brilliant white, you were considered clean and presentable in the eyes of your neighbors. After 14 chapters of navigating a world of lye soap, lice combs, and chamber pots flung from windows, the big question must finally be asked: did medieval hygiene actually work? Or was everyone living in a state of constant, barely managed decay, just one unwashed tunic away from a public health disaster? The short answer is, surprisingly, yes, it worked. Well enough. Now, let's be clear. It did not work by our modern standards. If you were to step out of a time machine into the heart of 14th century Paris, your 21st century nose would likely be overwhelmed and file for immediate retirement. But within its own context, medieval society was not a complete hygiene wasteland. People were not oblivious to cleanliness. They simply had a profoundly different understanding of what clean meant and how to achieve it. They had systems in place, even if those systems seem bizarre to us today. They understood the value of washing hands and faces, the cleansing properties of vinegar, and the importance of keeping pests at bay with meticulous combing. They developed tools, from the simple linen cloth used for a sponge bath to the harsh, effective soap used to scrub their essential undergarments. They had rituals, whether it was a seasonal bath or the weekly battle with the laundry. More importantly, their practices were guided by their own internal logic. The fear of opening one's pores to disease was, in a world without germ theory, a rational response to the terror of the plague. The emphasis on spiritual purity over physical cleanliness was a direct reflection of a society dominated by faith. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources they had. And surprisingly, some of their practices were hygienically sound, even if they didn't know why. The constant changing of linen undergarments was an excellent way to keep bacteria and grime away from the skin. Using vinegar and certain herbal rinses did have mild antibacterial effects. Even the much maligned public bathhouses, before they fell from grace, were effective at keeping large numbers of people clean. But yes, there is no escaping the reality. People smelled, they itched. They lived with a level of dust, dirt, and pests that would be unimaginable to most of us today. They shared bathwater, they shared beds, and they shared deeply, dangerously misinformed medical advice. And yet they survived. Many lived to old age, built cathedrals, wrote poetry, and managed to build a complex and enduring civilization. In the end, medieval hygiene was less of a science and more of a social performance. A clean linen collar signaled virtue. Well-combed hair, even if unwashed, showed discipline. And managing to not smell significantly worse than your neighbor was simply good manners. Their system worked in the same way that a medieval siege engine worked. It was clumsy, messy, and loud, but given the tools at hand, it was an impressive feat of engineering. Now that we have thoroughly explored the pungent world of medieval hygiene, let's travel even further back in time, to an era where order and sanitation were not just personal struggles, but principles engineered into the very bricks of a city. the ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. Mohenjo-Daro. If you were expecting dusty huts and chaotic alleyways, you would be profoundly mistaken. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro was so well planned it could make a modern city planner weep with envy. This was not a settlement that grew organically. It was meticulously organized from its inception. The city was laid out on a grid pattern, with wide, straight streets running north to south and east-west, intersecting at perfect right angles. It was as if the ancient architects took out a giant ruler and decided that urban life should be logical and geometric. But the true magic of Mohenjo-Daro wasn't just its neat layout. It was what lay beneath the surface. This ancient metropolis boasted one of the world's earliest and most sophisticated urban sanitation systems. Nearly every single house, from the grandest structures to the most modest dwellings, had access to water and, crucially, a drainage system. Wastewater flowed from homes into covered, brick-lined drains that ran alongside the main streets. This was revolutionary. These covered drains carried waste away from private homes and out of the city, preventing the kind of contamination and disease that would plague cities for millennia to come. The system included manholes, allowing for maintenance and cleaning. It was a testament to a society that understood 4,000 years ago that public health was directly linked to public engineering. The city itself was intelligently zoned. A raised mound, known as the Citadel, likely housed the city's administrative and religious centers, including the famous Great Bath, a large, waterproofed public pool that was probably used for ritual purification. Below the Citadel lay the lower city, the sprawling residential area where the majority of the population lived and worked. Even in this lower city, the attention to detail was astounding. Houses were built with standardized, baked bricks. Many homes had their own private wells to draw clean water and their own private bathrooms with toilets that connected to the citywide drainage network. Let that sink in for a moment. Ordinary citizens had indoor plumbing 4,500 years ago, while much of Europe was still grappling with chamber pots in the 18th century. What makes Mohenjo-Daro even more fascinating is the mystery of its decline. Around 1900 BCE, the city was abandoned. There are no signs of a great battle or a catastrophic fire. The cause remains a subject of debate, perhaps climate change, a shift in a river's course, or the disruption of trade routes. But what its people left behind was a silent, powerful legacy. The blueprint of a city built on the principles of order, intelligence, and a startlingly modern obsession with clean water. If Mohenjo-Daro was the tidy, efficient accountant of ancient cities, then Babylon was the theatrical, larger-than-life celebrity, flashy, vast, and steeped in legend. Babylon was more than just a city. It was a statement, rising and falling many times over the centuries. It reached its zenith around the 6th century BCE, under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar II, when it became the glittering, formidable heart of Mesopotamia. But don't let the poetic descriptions of its splendor fool you. This place was as carefully planned as it was majestic. Babylon was a fortress city, encircled by immense double walls, so thick, it was said, a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them. Access was controlled through a series of massive gates, the most famous of which was the breathtaking Ishtar Gate, adorned with brilliant, blue-glazed bricks and decorated with reliefs of dragons and bulls. It wasn't just an entrance. It was a declaration of divine protection and earthly power. At the very core of Babylon's urban design was a sacred and ceremonial axis, the processional way. This wasn't merely a street, it was a grand boulevard designed for the gods themselves to travel during religious festivals. This majestic road ran straight through the city, passing through the Ishtar Gate and connecting the Great Ziggurat at Temenanki, perhaps the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, to the main temple of the city's patron god, Marduk. Urban planning here was part piety, part propaganda. To live in Babylon was to walk along a divine narrative every single day. While the city's layout respected the curve of the Euphrates River, it was also smartly zoned. There were distinct quarters for residential living, sprawling temple complexes, bustling markets, and administrative centers. The Euphrates River, which flowed directly through the city, was not just a source of water, but also a vital, navigable artery for trade and transport, bringing goods and visitors from across the known world into its very heart. When it came to sanitation, Babylon's systems were functional, though perhaps not as meticulously engineered as those in the Indus Valley. Wealthier homes had bathrooms with clay pipes that would channel waste into cesspits or a network of municipal canals. The city's engineers were clearly not amateurs, and they understood the importance of managing wastewater in a densely populated urban environment. In a move that speaks volumes about the ambition of its rulers, many of the bricks used to build the city were inscribed with the name of King Nebuchadnezzar II. It was a form of royal branding on an epic scale. If you are going to build a city for the ages, complete with canals and sewers, you might as well sign your name on every single piece of it. Babylon was a city designed from the ground up to inspire awe in both mortals and gods. Every wall, every temple, and every grand avenue was a carefully placed piece in a larger puzzle of power, faith, and cosmic order. It's no wonder that centuries later, even conquerors like Alexander the Great were so impressed that they considered making Babylon the capital of their own empires. After walking a street built for a god, everything else must have seemed rather ordinary. Roughly 1,000 years before the Aztecs stumbled upon its magnificent ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were born, this ancient Mexican metropolis was already a masterclass in urban design. At its peak, around 500 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest and most powerful cities in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 100,000. And unlike the chaotic sprawl of many modern cities, this place was mapped out with the deliberate precision of a sacred geometer who never once forgot their protractor. The city's most iconic feature is the grand boulevard known as the Avenue of the Dead, despite its rather grim name, courtesy of the later Aztecs who mistook the platforms lining it for tombs. This was not a cemetery. It was a magnificent ceremonial axis, stretching for over 2 miles. This grand avenue was the sacred spine of the city, connecting the Pyramid of the Moon at its northern end with the enormous Pyramid of the Sun and other major temple complexes. It was the stage upon which the city's ritual life unfolded. This is where things get even more fascinating. The entire city of Teotihuacan was laid out on a strict grid system, but it was a grid tilted approximately 15.5 degrees east of true north. This was no accident. Scholars believe this specific alignment was cosmologically significant, perhaps corresponding to the position of a particular star on the horizon, or oriented towards a sacred mountain. This was not just urban planning. This was urban planning with a cosmic compass. and the city was absolutely zoned. Residential areas were organized into large, walled compounds, many of which housed multiple families who shared central patios and drainage systems. Some of these compounds were lavishly decorated with murals, indicating the homes of the elite, while others were more functional, suggesting a working-class population. It was an organized, stratified society, made visible in stone and stucco. Teotihuacan also possessed a complex and well-engineered water management system. A network of canals and underground drains ran alongside the streets and through the residential compounds. This system helped to control runoff from the heavy summer rains, preventing floods, and managing the city's water resources. The city's builders clearly understood their environment and planned accordingly. You get the sense they would have been deeply offended by a simple pothole. There is still so much we don't know about Teotihuacan. We have not definitively identified its rulers, and its original name is lost to time. Yet, the evidence of their intelligence is undeniable. This city was built to impress both the eyes of its residents and the eyes of the gods in the sky. It was a blueprint of cosmic order, a place where the human world was designed to mirror the heavens. When the Aztecs discovered its towering pyramids and wide, silent avenues, centuries later, they were so overcome with awe that they couldn't imagine it being built by mere mortals. They concluded that it must have been the work of giants, or the gods themselves. And honestly, after contemplating its perfect symmetry and celestial alignment, who could possibly blame them? When we think of ancient urban planning, it's easy to imagine a single, powerful ruler, a pharaoh or an emperor, imposing their grand vision upon a city. But in the Indus Valley civilization, the story seems to be different. The planning here appears to come not from a king's decree, but from a shared cultural blueprint, so powerful and so ingrained that multiple cities across a vast region ended up as near-perfect architectural clones. Take the city of Harappa, another major urban center of the civilization, located in modern-day Pakistan. Just like Mohenjo-Daro, it was laid out on a grid-like pattern. It featured the same clear zoning, with distinct areas for residential housing, workshops, and public buildings. Its builders used the same standardized baked brick sizes, and most remarkably, it possessed the same kind of advanced drainage and sanitation system, with private bathrooms and covered street drains. The consistency is astonishing. Then there is the city of Lothal, located near the Arabian Sea in what is now India. Lothal showcases another layer of Indus Valley genius, sophisticated port planning. Archaeologists have uncovered a massive, meticulously engineered dockyard, complete with a basin and a system of sluice gates to control the water level, which would have adjusted for the tides. This wasn't just a town by the water. It was a purpose-built maritime trade hub, designed with a deep understanding of hydrology. What makes this uniformity across hundreds of miles so profound is the conspicuous absence of kings. Across the ruins of these great cities, we find no grand palaces, no monumental statues of rulers, and no inscriptions boasting of military conquests. The power that built these incredibly organized cities does not seem to have been the power of a single, glorified monarch. Instead, it's believed these cities were likely governed by councils of priests, merchants, or community elders, efficient administrators who prioritized trade, ritual, and public health over personal glory. Their authority seems to have come from their ability to organize and engineer society, not from conquering it. Their focus was on the collective good, not the glorification of an individual. Further evidence of this regulated, cohesive society comes from the countless artifacts uncovered, most notably a system of standardized weights and measures. Cubical weights, made of stone, have been found in virtually every Indus city, suggesting a highly organized and fair system of trade that was enforced across the entire civilization. You could travel from Harappa to Mohenjo-Daro and trust that a measure of grain would be the same. This points to an urban ideal that was remarkably collective. The uniformity in home construction, the universal access to water and sanitation, and the focus on public works like granaries and baths suggest a society where planning wasn't a privilege for the elite, but a principle that benefited everyone. The true architects of the Indus Valley weren't just building cities, they were building a society where order, hygiene, and commerce were embedded in every single brick. When we think of zoning today, we often picture city council meetings, complex legal codes, and arguments over whether a new coffee shop is too close to a residential neighborhood. But the fundamental idea of zoning, of dividing a city into designated areas for living, working, worshiping, and yes, even for dumping garbage, is not a modern invention. It's an ancient and surprisingly widespread practice, and the cities we've explored were masters of it. Let's look again at Mohenjo-Daro. The division was clear and logical. On a high, fortified mound stood the citadel, which housed the city's public and ceremonial buildings, the great bath, large granaries, and what were likely administrative halls. Below it, in the lower city, lay the carefully planned residential quarters, with broad avenues separating the blocks. Workshops, like those for pottery and metalworking, were often situated at the city's edge, a sensible decision to keep smoke, noise, and industrial waste away from homes. Now jump over to Babylon, where zoning was driven not just by common sense, but by a powerful combination of ritual and royal propaganda. The heart of the city was dominated by the massive temple complexes and the king's palace, linked by the grand processional way. Elite homes and administrative buildings were clustered nearby. In the most desirable real estate, commoners, craftspeople, and the bustling markets were organized in quarters further out. Your address in Babylon was a direct reflection of your proximity to power, both divine and earthly. Then there is Teotihuacan, where zoning reached a level of near-surgical precision. The city's layout followed its cosmically aligned grid, but each sector had a clear and distinct identity. There were residential compounds for the masses, specialized zones for craft production, like obsidian tools or ceramics, vast open plazas for markets, and of course, the sacred temple complexes. Most remarkably, archaeologists have found evidence of entire neighborhoods that seem to have housed immigrants from other parts of Mesoamerica. For example, there was a distinct Oaxacan barrio where people from the Zapotic region lived and worked, even building their homes in an architectural style reminiscent of their homeland. This wasn't just zoning. This was state-sponsored, multicultural urban planning in 500 CE. This intense level of spatial organization demonstrates a critical point. These were not just collections of buildings, they were intentional societies. The layout of the city was a physical manifestation of its values, whether they were spiritual, political, or economic. Where you lived, where you worked, and where you worshipped were all part of a pre-mapped, highly organized system. These ancient planners understood not only how to engineer drains and build walls, but also how to shape human behavior and relationships through the deliberate use of space. They did it without advanced survey equipment or computer software, relying instead on observation, mathematics, and a powerful, shared vision for how a city should function. When a society can enforce zoning laws on such a grand scale, you know their urban planning game was truly ahead of its time. We love to imagine the ancient world as gloriously filthy, a landscape of muddy streets, unwashed crowds, and the unmistakable perfume of open sewers. But the truth is, some ancient cities cared so deeply about sanitation that their public hygiene systems would make a 19th century European city look primitive by comparison. They understood that managing waste was essential to urban living. Let's return to our sanitation superstar, Mohenjo-Daro. The system here was nothing short of breathtaking. Nearly every house, regardless of its size, had its own private bathing area, often with a waterproofed sloped floor that directed water into a drain. This drain then connected to a larger, covered sewer line running beneath the main street. Image, cutaway diagram of Mohenjo-Daro's drain system. These street drains were lined with bricks, expertly constructed, and even featured manhole covers for access and cleaning. This wasn't just clever, it was a fully integrated municipal wastewater system. Compare that to Babylon, where public hygiene was perhaps more symbolic, but still present. The city was crisscrossed by canals and drainage channels that helped carry away water. Palaces and temples had elaborate bathrooms with clay pipes that fed into cesspits or the larger canal system, while the average citizen likely relied on simpler solutions. There is evidence that the Babylonians understood the basic principles of moving waste away from living quarters. Now let's zoom into Teotihuacan in the heart of Mexico. While not as singularly obsessed with drainage as the Indus Valley cities, Teotihuacan still featured carefully engineered systems to manage water. There were stone-lined stormwater canals that ran alongside major avenues to prevent flooding during the rainy season. Many of the elite residential complexes had their own internal drainage systems, channeling wastewater away from the living areas. Cleanliness here was likely tied to religious purity, especially in the sacred precincts of the city. This concern for water management wasn't limited to the great metropolises. Smaller cities across the ancient world reflect a deep understanding of hydrology. The cities of the Indus Valley, like Harappa and Lothal, consistently show evidence of strategically placed wells, reservoirs to store water, and streets that were gently sloped to allow for natural drainage. They were planning entire towns with gravity and seasonal monsoons in mind, and pulling it off over 4,000 years ago. What makes all of this so impressive isn't just the technology itself, it's the mindset it reveals. These civilizations didn't see water as something to simply be used and discarded. They viewed it as a powerful force to be channeled, managed, and respected. They understood that in a dense city, the waste of one person quickly becomes the problem of everyone. This meant that hygiene wasn't just a private concern or a luxury for the elite. It was a public good, embedded in the very design of the city. While modern cities still struggle with aging infrastructure and waste management, these ancients were already digging trenches and laying bricks, quietly proving that a clean, healthy city has always been a well-planned one. If temples were the sacred spaces where ancient peoples spoke to the gods, then markets were where they negotiated with each other, likely arguing over the price of grain and textiles. Every great ancient city we've explored had a beating economic heart. And that heart pulsed in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, regulated trade routes, and deliberate economic zoning. Commerce wasn't an accident. It was an integral part of the urban design. In Babylon, for example, markets were not chaotic bazaars squeezed into leftover space. They were institutionalized, woven into the city's grid, and strictly regulated by law. The famous Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest and most complete legal texts ever discovered, dedicates dozens of clauses to fair trade practices, contracts, and the standardization of weights and measures. In the bustling city squares, merchants traded everything from wine to livestock, while scribes recorded transactions on clay tablets. This wasn't just shopping, it was commerce with a robust legal framework. Now, shift to Teotihuacan in Mexico, where the market system appears to have been remarkably vibrant and decentralized. The city boasted enormous open-air market plazas, where thousands of people would gather to trade goods from all over Mesoamerica. Here, you could find obsidian tools, precious cacao beans, brilliant feathers for ceremonial dress, salt, and intricately decorated pottery. Evidence suggests that different residential compounds specialized in specific crafts, creating an ancient version of a local artisan's market, where your supplier for pottery might live just a block away. Meanwhile, back in the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show clear evidence of a highly regulated economy. Archaeologists have unearthed caches of standardized cubical stone weights across the entire region, signaling a uniform system for weighing goods. Wide avenues were designed to accommodate the movement of goods from workshops to centralized granaries and warehouses. Furthermore, the discovery of Indus Valley seals in faraway Mesopotamia confirms that they were part of a thriving international trade network, a truly globalized economy in the Bronze Age. But these markets were more than just places of business. They were the social hubs of the city. In Babylon, the marketplace was where you heard the latest gossip, settled disputes, and saw who was wearing the latest fashions. In Teotihuacan, it was a multicultural melting pot, where traders from the Gulf Coast might mingle with artisans from the Oaxacan highlands. Markets were where the city came alive, a vibrant intersection of commerce and culture. The planners of these ancient cities understood this. They didn't just build homes and temples, they built the infrastructure for a thriving economy. They designed wide streets for transport, designated zones for craft production, and created public squares for trade. Behind every imposing temple wall and fortress gate, there was a plan for how the city and its people would sustain themselves, proving that a prosperous city has always been a well-planned one. In the ancient world, urban planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts. It was fundamentally about the gods. Temples weren't tucked away in quiet corners. They exploded from the center of the city, dominated the skyline, and were granted the most important real estate. If the market was the city's heartbeat, the temple was its soul, and ancient planners made sure that every resident knew it. Start with Babylon, where the skyline was pierced by the colossal Edamananki, a ziggurat dedicated to the patron god Marduk. This was no modest shrine. It was a multi-tiered, man-made mountain of baked brick, possibly reaching a height of 90 meters. It was designed to be a literal bridge between the earthly realm and the heavens. This wasn't just an act of faith, it was centralized urban messaging. All roads, both literally and figuratively, led to the temple. Teotihuacan, too, placed its spiritual heart front and center. The immense pyramid of the sun and the slightly smaller pyramid of the moon were not just ceremonial structures. They were the city's urban anchors. The Grand Avenue of the Dead served as a sacred causeway, connecting these monuments and aligning the entire city with celestial events like solstices or the rising of certain stars. The pyramids weren't just background props. They were cosmic coordinates that guided the flow of both foot traffic and philosophy. Then there's the fascinating case of Mohenjo-Daro. While it lacked the towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia or the massive pyramids of Mesoamerica, its spiritual center was no less significant. Here we find the Great Bath, a large, meticulously constructed public water tank. This was no mere swimming pool. It was built with waterproofed bricks, surrounded by colonnades, and featured a sophisticated drainage system. It was almost certainly used for ritual purification, a place for communal rites of cleanliness and spiritual rebirth. In all of these cities, the sacred spaces were deliberately and functionally integrated into the urban fabric. They were not isolated compounds for priests. The temples were connected to processional roads, flanked by public plazas for gathering, and often situated near the administrative centers of power. This shows that worship wasn't a separate activity from daily life. It was the very framework of life itself. These were not secular societies that happened to have temples. They were sacred landscapes disguised as cities. Every street that was carved, every plaza that was paved, and every brick that was laid was part of a larger spiritual choreography, designed to honor the gods and align the human world with the divine order. The lesson from these ancient cities is clear. For them, building a city was not just an act of engineering. It was an act of devotion, and in their grand design, the gods always got the best seat in the house. It's tempting to think of our modern cities as gleaming products of recent innovation, born from blueprints, bulldozers, and civil engineering degrees. But if you dig a little deeper, both literally and figuratively, you'll find that the very bones of urban life were laid down thousands of years ago by planners who worked with little more than copper tools, star charts, and an incredible vision for the future. The fundamental DNA of city planning was already being mapped out in the ancient world. The concept of a grid system, the practice of zoning, the necessity of public sanitation, the creation of civic centers, and the integration of sacred spaces. All of these were etched into the earth by civilizations we often underestimate. They didn't just build settlements. They designed complex, functioning urban organisms. Take the legacy of drainage from Mohenjo-Daro. They didn't just dig a few ditches. They engineered a multi-level wastewater system that provided sanitation to nearly everyone. The idea of universal access to clean water and waste removal, a goal still elusive in parts of the modern world, was a standard feature in this Bronze Age metropolis. Babylon laid the groundwork for regulated commerce and the use of grand architecture to reinforce power, while Teotihuacan gave us the template for a cosmic city where every road and temple points to something bigger than itself. But the influence goes beyond engineering. These ancient cities were designed to shape human behavior. Wide avenues like the processional way in Babylon or the Avenue of the Dead in Teotihuacan were built to accommodate grand parades and religious processions, creating a sense of collective identity. Enclosed courtyards in residential compounds fostered a sense of community. Zoning didn't just separate workshops from homes. It shaped how people interacted and how authority was perceived. The echoes of these ancient ideas are all around us today. The grid systems that define cities like New York are a direct descendant of the orderly streets of Harappa. The canals of Amsterdam have their roots in the water management systems of Babylon. The very idea of a civic center, a public square where people gather, is an invention of these ancestral cityscapes. What has changed is the technology, not the core principles. We still design our cities around the same fundamental needs: access to resources, opportunities for trade, spaces for spiritual or civic life, and the desire for spectacle. We still measure property, regulate commerce, and try to manage waste. So, the next time you walk down a busy city street, take a moment to listen. Beneath the noise of traffic and the hum of modern life, you might just hear the quiet whisper of ancient ideas. You're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of history, following a path first laid by people who believed that good living required good planning. From the grand ancient blueprints of entire civilizations, we now narrow our focus. We turn from the collective to the individual, to the life of a single man who was himself a grand architect of his time, an emperor who would reshape the Roman world, not through conquest, but through culture, consolidation, and stone. This is the story of Hadrian. He was not born in the heart of Rome, but on its distant western fringe. Publius Aelius Hadrianus came into the world in 76 CE in the city of Italica, a thoroughly Romanized town in the province of Hispania, Baetica, in what is now southern Spain. Though geographically an outsider, his family was wealthy, powerful, and, most importantly, related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the man who would one day rule the Roman Empire. Hadrian's life was shaped by an early tragedy. He lost both of his parents by the age of 10, at which point he became the ward of two men, his relative Trajan and a Roman knight named Publius Acilius Ataeanus. These two guardians would steer the young Hadrian onto the path of power, a path that was not always a natural fit for his temperament. While most young Roman nobles were drawn to military glory and political maneuvering, Hadrian was captivated by the culture of Greece. He adored Greek literature, philosophy, and art. He spoke the language fluently, read Homer obsessively, and was so passionate about all things Hellenic that he earned the youthful nickname Graeculus, or the Little Greek. It was a title that hinted at both his intellectual pursuits and his slight otherness in a world dominated by Roman pragmatism. But Rome did not run on poetry. Like all ambitious men of his class, Hadrian had to serve. He began his career as a military tribune, proving himself to be a competent, if not legendary, officer in various posts along the Danube frontier. He steadily climbed the cursus honorum, Rome's traditional ladder of political offices, serving as a quaestor and a tribune, always in the orbit of the increasingly powerful Trajan. His connection to the imperial family was cemented through marriage. He was wed to Vibia Sabina, who was Trajan's grandniece. The union was a brilliant political move, securing his position within the dynasty. But by all accounts, it was a cold and distant relationship. The marriage was likely loveless, as Hadrian's deepest emotional and intellectual connections seemed to lie elsewhere, in the realm of philosophical companionship. This was the central tension of Hadrian's early life. He was a man of artistic and intellectual passions, born into a world that demanded military and administrative duty. He was a Spaniard with a Greek soul, destined to rule a Roman world. He was an emperor in the making, but one who was already dreaming of marble columns and philosophical dialogues, while others dreamt only of conquest. When Emperor Trajan fell gravely ill in the summer of 117 CE, the Roman Empire held its breath. the question of succession was dangerously murky. Trajan, a man of decisive action in all other matters, had never publicly named his heir. The political elite in Rome were divided, and many wondered if Hadrian, the intellectual Spaniard with a Greek soul, was truly the right man to lead the world's greatest military power. Trajan died in a small town in Asia Minor, far from the capital. Then, in a turn of events that was either incredibly convenient or deeply suspicious, a letter arrived in Rome. It stated that on his deathbed, Trajan had officially adopted Hadrian as his son and successor. The adoption was witnessed by Trajan's wife Plotina, who had long been a supporter of Hadrian, and by his loyal guardian Attianus. The timing was impeccable, so impeccable that whispers of forgery and political maneuvering immediately began to circulate through the Senate. Did Plotina, eager to see her protege on the throne, orchestrate the whole affair? We will never know for certain, but regardless of the whispers, the letter was accepted. The Senate, facing the reality of Hadrian already having the loyalty of the Eastern armies, had little choice but to ratify his accession. On August 11th, 117 CE, Hadrian officially became the Emperor of Rome. His transition to power, however, was far from smooth. He was immediately faced with crises on multiple fronts. The empire, under Trajan's aggressive military campaigns, was overextended and financially strained. In his first major act as emperor, Hadrian made a pragmatic but deeply unpopular decision. He withdrew Roman forces from the newly conquered eastern provinces of Armenia and Mesopotamia, abandoning Trajan's final conquests to the senators and generals who had bled for those territories. It was an act of cowardice. Then came the blood. Shortly after Hadrian took power, 4 of the most prominent senators in Rome, all former consuls and all men who had been potential rivals for the throne, were arrested and executed on vague charges of conspiracy. Hadrian was away from Rome at the time and publicly denied any involvement, placing the blame squarely on his guardian Attianus. Few believed him. This single act of political ruthlessness would permanently poison his relationship with the Senate for the rest of his reign. Yet, despite this turbulent start, Hadrian's first actions also revealed a different side of his leadership. He canceled a vast amount of unpaid taxes, distributed money generously to the people of Rome, and secured the loyalty of the legions with large cash bonuses. He was making a clear statement. His reign would not be one of endless, costly wars, but one of internal stability and prosperity. Hadrian may have come to power through whispered corridors and a letter of dubious origin, but once he held the imperial purple, he wasted no time in demonstrating that he would rule on his own terms. The era of expansion was over. The era of Hadrian had begun. Hadrian was not an emperor content to rule from the comfort of a marble palace in Rome. Unlike most of his predecessors, he saw the empire not as a distant map of territories to be managed, but as a living, breathing landscape of diverse cultures and peoples, and he was determined to walk it. In one of the most defining acts of his reign, Hadrian spent more than half of his 21 years as emperor traveling, visiting nearly every province under his control. These were not ceremonial tours. This was hands-on governance. He embarked on his first great journey in 121 CE, a trip that would last for nearly 5 years. He traveled through Gaul, Germania, and then crossed over to Britannia. He did not travel in a fancy chariot, but often on foot or horseback, alongside his soldiers, sharing their rations and their hardships. It was part imperial inspection, part military pilgrimage. It was in Britannia that Hadrian conceived his most famous legacy. Witnessing firsthand the instability and constant raids along Rome's northern frontier, he abandoned the policy of pushing further into the highlands of Caledonia. Instead, he ordered the construction of a massive defensive wall, stretching 73 miles from coast to coast. Hadrian's wall was more than a military barrier. It was a powerful psychological statement. It was a line drawn on the earth, a declaration of the empire's limits. This is Rome, that is not. From Britain, his journeys continued. He traveled through Spain and then across the Mediterranean to Africa, where he inspected legions and commissioned new building projects. He moved through Asia Minor, founding cities and funding the reconstruction of temples. In Egypt, he was hailed as a living god, a pharaoh in a toga, and majestically sailed the Nile. Everywhere he went, he left his mark, tying the disparate parts of the empire together with a thread of imperial presence. But his favorite destination was always Greece. Hadrian's deep love for Hellenic culture was not just a youthful affectation. It was a lifelong passion. He was initiated into the ancient Eleusinian mysteries. He patronized philosophers and poets, and he poured vast sums of money into beautifying Greek cities, especially Athens. In Athens, he was a benefactor on a grand scale. He financed the completion of the colossal temple of Olympian Zeus, a project that had been abandoned for centuries. He built a grand library and sponsored festivals, seeking to revive the city's status as the cultural heart of the world. He wasn't just a Roman conqueror visiting a subject land. He was a devotee paying homage at the cradle of a civilization he revered. Hadrian's travels were not vacations. They were the central policy of his reign. By appearing in every corner of his empire, he transformed the abstract idea of Rome into a tangible presence. He wasn't just the emperor in Rome. He was the emperor of the entire Roman world, and he made sure everyone knew it by sharing their dust, walking their roads, and investing in their cities. Hadrian was not an emperor content to rule from the comfort of a marble palace in Rome. Unlike most of his predecessors, he saw the empire not as a distant map of territories to be managed, but as a living, breathing landscape of diverse cultures and peoples, and he was determined to walk it. In one of the most defining acts of his reign, Hadrian spent more than half of his 21 years as emperor traveling, visiting nearly every province under his control. These were not ceremonial tours. This was hands-on governance. He embarked on his first great journey in 121 CE, a trip that would last for nearly 5 years. He traveled through Gaul, Germania, and then crossed over to Britannia. He did not travel in a fancy chariot, but often on foot or horseback, alongside his soldiers, sharing their rations and their hardships. It was part imperial inspection, part military pilgrimage. It was in Britannia that Hadrian conceived his most famous legacy. Witnessing firsthand the instability and constant raids along Rome's northern frontier, he abandoned the policy of pushing further into the highlands of Caledonia. Instead, he ordered the construction of a massive defensive wall, stretching 73 miles from coast to coast. Hadrian's wall was more than a military barrier. It was a powerful psychological statement. It was a line drawn on the earth, a declaration of the empire's limits. This is Rome, that is not. From Britain, his journeys continued. He traveled through Spain and then across the Mediterranean to Africa, where he inspected legions and commissioned new building projects. He moved through Asia Minor, founding cities and funding the reconstruction of temples. In Egypt, he was hailed as a living god, a pharaoh in a toga, and majestically sailed the Nile. Everywhere he went, he left his mark, tying the disparate parts of the empire together with a thread of imperial presence. But his favorite destination was always Greece. Hadrian's deep love for Hellenic culture was not just a youthful affectation, it was a lifelong passion. He was initiated into the ancient Eleusinian mysteries, he patronized philosophers and poets, and he poured vast sums of money into beautifying Greek cities, especially Athens. In Athens, he was a benefactor on a grand scale. He financed the completion of the colossal temple of Olympian Zeus, a project that had been abandoned for centuries. He built a grand library and sponsored festivals, seeking to revive the city's status as the cultural heart of the world. He wasn't just a Roman conqueror visiting a subject land. He was a devotee paying homage at the cradle of a civilization he revered. Hadrian's travels were not vacations. They were the central policy of his reign. By appearing in every corner of his empire, he transformed the abstract idea of Rome into a tangible presence. He wasn't just the emperor in Rome. He was the emperor of the entire Roman world, and he made sure everyone knew it by sharing their dust, walking their roads, and investing in their cities. Hadrian didn't just walk the empire, he reimagined it in stone and concrete. He was a builder by passion, not just by political necessity. His reign marked a golden age of Roman architecture, a period when buildings became more than just functional structures. They became expressions of philosophy, power, and a new, unified vision for the empire. Perhaps his most iconic and enduring contribution within Rome itself was the Pantheon. While an earlier version of the temple had burned down, Hadrian rebuilt it around 126 CE, transforming it into one of the most breathtaking buildings in human history. With its massive, unreinforced concrete dome, still the largest in the world, and the famous oculus opening to the sky, the Pantheon was a marvel of engineering. It was a perfect sphere, a cosmic temple that represented the heavens, a testament to both the gods and the genius of Roman architects. Then there was his sprawling private villa at Tivoli, a vast estate east of Rome that was less a home and more an architectural laboratory. Unlike any imperial villa before it, Tivoli was a curated landscape of Hadrian's memories and ideals. He recreated famous buildings and landscapes from his travels across the empire. There were Greek colonnades, Egyptian-themed pools and statues, and even a long canal meant to evoke the Nile. It was a philosopher-king's dreamscape, a miniature version of the entire world he ruled, brought together in one place. Across the provinces, Hadrian launched massive infrastructure campaigns. We've already mentioned his work in Athens, where he completed the Temple of Olympian Zeus, a project that had languished for centuries. In North Africa, he funded the construction of new roads, aqueducts, and granaries that sustained the region. In Asia Minor, he financed the rebuilding of entire cities that had been devastated by earthquakes. However, his building efforts were not always benevolent. In a move that would have devastating consequences, he decided to refound the city of Jerusalem, which had been destroyed by the Romans decades earlier, as a new Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina. His plan to build a temple to Jupiter on the site of the sacred Jewish temple sparked outrage and planted the seeds for a violent revolt. Hadrian's architectural style was as eclectic and worldly as his travels. He masterfully blended the engineering might of Rome, its arches, vaults, and mastery of concrete, with the elegant aesthetics of Greece, the mystical motifs of Egypt, and the local building traditions of the provinces. He didn't just stamp a Roman design on the world. He wove the world's designs into the fabric of Rome. For Hadrian, architecture was a language. It was a silent way of communicating his vision for the empire. Unified, secure, culturally rich, and enduring. Through bricks and mortar, he didn't just preserve the empire. He gave its soul a physical form. Among the countless soldiers, senators, and servants who walked beside Hadrian during his endless travels, none would leave a deeper or more tragic imprint on the emperor's soul than Antinous. He was a beautiful young man from Bithynia, a region in modern-day Turkey, whose life and untimely death would inspire one of the most unusual and personal religious cults in Roman history. Antinous first appears in Hadrian's life around the year 124 CE, likely as a teenager in the emperor's entourage. Ancient sources and the hundreds of statues that survive of him depict a youth of stunning, quiet beauty. He became Hadrian's favorite companion, his hunting partner, and his constant shadow on journeys throughout the Eastern Empire, particularly in Greece and Egypt. While never officially defined, their relationship was widely understood to be a profound and romantic one. In a society where such relationships were not unusual, Hadrian's bond with Antinous stood out for its visible intensity. The emperor, often described as aloof and intellectual, clearly adored the young man. This made the tragedy that followed all the more shocking. In the autumn of 130 CE, while the imperial party was sailing down the Nile River in Egypt, Antinous fell into the water and drowned. The exact circumstances of his death are shrouded in mystery. Some ancient writers claimed it was a simple, tragic accident. Others whispered of darker possibilities, a ritual sacrifice to prolong Hadrian's life, or even a suicide, with Antinous perhaps feeling that his youth and beauty, the source of his favor, were beginning to fade. Whatever the truth, Hadrian was utterly and completely devastated. His grief was unlike anything a Roman emperor had ever displayed. He wept openly and mourned his lost companion with a passion that bordered on obsession. But Hadrian did not just grieve. He was an emperor, and he would use his power to make his beloved immortal. In an extraordinary act, he deified Antinous, declaring him to be a new god. Near the spot on the Nile where Antinous died, Hadrian founded a new city, Antinopolis, a grand settlement built in his honor. He then established a formal cult to the new god, Antinous, which spread with remarkable speed across the entire empire. Temples were built, coins were minted with his image, and festivals were held in his name. Hundreds, if not thousands, of statues of Antinous were commissioned, portraying him as a figure of serene, divine beauty, often identified with gods like Osiris or Dionysus. He became a kind of pagan saint, a god of grief, rebirth, and eternal youth. Through this unprecedented act of imperial memorial, Hadrian didn't just ensure his beloved would never be forgotten, he elevated their personal love story into a public religion, forever carving it into the spiritual landscape of the Roman world. Hadrian's reign, though often marked by philosophy and architecture, was not without fire, and none of that fire burned hotter than the Bar Kokhba revolt, the last and most violent Jewish uprising against Roman rule. This brutal conflict would test the emperor's patience, reveal his ruthless side, and leave a deep and lasting scar on the province of Judea. The seeds of the rebellion, as we've noted, were sown by Hadrian himself. His decision to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina, and his plan to erect a temple to Jupiter on the sacred Temple Mount were seen by the Jewish population as the ultimate act of sacrilege. In 132 CE, a charismatic military leader named Simon Bar Kokhba rose up, and the province exploded into open revolt. His forces swiftly overwhelmed the local Roman garrisons, and for nearly 3 years they maintained an independent Jewish state. Hadrian, initially caught off guard, responded with cold, strategic fury. He summoned his best generals and amassed a massive army. What followed was not a series of pitched battles, but a brutal war of attrition. Roman legions moved slowly across the land, employing scorched earth tactics, destroying towns and villages, and showing no mercy to rebels or the civilians who supported them. By 135 CE, the revolt was crushed. The devastation was immense. Ancient sources claim over 500,000 people were killed, and countless more were enslaved. Hadrian, to erase the memory of the rebellion, renamed the province Syria Palestina. The emperor who built libraries and adored Greek poetry had shown his iron fist. It remains one of the darkest chapters of his reign, a harsh reminder that he would rule with Roman steel when challenged. After the war, and as he entered his final years, the restless emperor began to slow down. He was afflicted by a chronic illness, likely heart disease, that left him weak and bloated. He grew increasingly reclusive and melancholic, retreating to his villa at Tivoli. His final years were marked by a deep obsession with his own mortality, captured in a haunting poem he wrote to his own soul, beginning with the line, Animula, vagula, blondula, little soul, gentle and wandering. His final great act was to secure the future of the empire. After his first chosen heir died unexpectedly, Hadrian made a brilliant and far-sighted decision. In 138 CE, he adopted the respected senator Antoninus Pius, but on one condition, that Antoninus, in turn, adopt the promising young Marcus Aurelius. With this single move, Hadrian engineered the next 2 generations of stable, enlightened leadership, birthing the era of the 5 good emperors. Hadrian died that same year, leaving behind an empire that was not larger, but far more secure, cohesive, and culturally vibrant than he had found it. He remains a paradox, a builder who also destroyed, a lover of peace who could be utterly ruthless, an intellectual who commanded legions. His reign marked a profound turning point, where the emperor became less a conqueror and more a curator of civilization. Thank you for joining us on this long journey through the worlds of hygiene and history. We hope you found this quiet exploration restful and informative. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes to accompany us on future travels into the past. Until next time, sleep well.